Hi, I'm Mark Allman. I'm a professor here at Merrimack College with Mel Duncan, the co-founder of Nonviolent Peaceforce. So Mel, tell me, how did you get into this work of doing nonviolent intervention and peacemaking?
It's been a lifelong pursuit. I've been an organizer since I was a teenager, organizing on issues of peace, justice, and the environment. In the late 1990s, I was confronted by a Sufi on the way in which I worked, which was always us versus them, right versus wrong, good versus evil. 50% plus one meant we kicked their butt. And this Sufi was challenging me to start organizing from an understanding of our unity. That led me on a sojourn for the next year. I completed that journey at a Buddhist monastery in southern France with a Vietnamese monk by the name of Thich Nhat Hanh. And while there, he too challenged that we were no longer at a place in history where we could afford to take sides, that the stakes were too high, that we were facing them together, and that we needed to go forward from an understanding of unity. It was upon leaving Plum Village, riding on a bus in southern France, I wrote in my notebook a thought piece about a nonviolent peace force. Now, this had been an experience that I had had earlier in the 1980s when I and a group of people went to Nicaragua during the Contra War, when we believed that if there were gringos in the villages that were being attacked during that war, that those villages and the civilians would not be attacked. Indeed, that's what happened over a 7-year period. And we found that our theory was true a couple of years later, when in 1986, in the Iran-Contra hearings, it was confirmed that that war was being orchestrated out of the U.S. Embassy in Honduras. So upon leaving Plum Village and having this vision, I found my way to a conference in 1999 in The Hague called the Hague Appeal for Peace, where people had gathered from around the world to put together an agenda to make war obsolete in the next century. Now, we haven't gotten a good start on it, but the pieces started to fall into place. I brought this vision. I found a number of people who shared this vision, and we started putting together the effort to form Nonviolent Peaceforce. One of the most important things that we found during that period, Mark, was that this idea of sending well-trained, unarmed civilian protectors to areas of violent conflict had not started with me in a Buddhist monastery, or started with the other people who formed that nucleus at The Hague, but was a recurrent vision and had occurred and recurred to enough of us around the world that we were willing to take the next step in devoting energy, our resources, indeed our lives, to creating a large-scale, standing, professional, nonviolent peace force that could effectively protect civilians in times of violent conflict.
Okay, so everyone wants to know, how does that actually work?
Yeah.
I mean, you just send civilians into a conflict zone and say, make peace?
Yes. Why would armed actors, whether they be working for the government or non-state actors, why would they care about a group of well-trained, unarmed civilian peacekeepers? And what we found, we've actually studied it, is that there are a number of reasons, both that fall into the category of encouragement and deterrence. Okay. If we look at deterrence, what we find is that most armed groups, whether they be state or non-state, have a chain of command. Seldom are the decisions to kill civilians made at the field level. Mm-hmm. Those are made at the political level and at the upper levels of the military command. Mm-hmm. So it's our business to know that chain of command, to know those vulnerability points down that chain of command, and to address them. So, for example, at the political level, often armed actors and the people who are running them are concerned about their international reputations. So they don't want people like me at the UN in New York or my colleagues in Geneva or in Brussels talking about what actually is happening on the ground. We also find down the chain of command at the military levels that there is an increasing concern about international tribunals, the International Criminal Court, and those types of judicial bodies. So if anyone ever doubts, do things make a difference? Does change? This has happened during most of our lifetimes, the emergence of the International Criminal Court. They don't want people like our unarmed civilian protectors, who often have a background in international humanitarian law or human rights, showing up as witnesses in a couple of years in The Hague. Going down the chain of command, there are religious concerns, there are family and community concerns, and there is also the concern that many people don't want to do this kind of horrible act in front of others. Then that's the deterrence part. There's the whole encouragement part too, where we find that if we are there committed to nonviolence, nonpartisan, that tends to encourage other people in the community. It tends to help them to step forward and to say, I'm a part of this, or to encourage what they're already doing. Because in the most violent places in the world, Mark, we have found that there are always strong, courageous peace builders and human rights defenders. More often than not, regardless of culture, that work's being led by women. And those women are there and they are strong. And so just by us being there and supporting them, that extends their life and their ability and the space for them to be able to do their work.
All right, so this sounds great in theory.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about give me an example of a success story, like how it works, and also maybe something about how big is Nonviolent Peaceforce? Where are you, and how many people do you have in the field?
A year ago, right now, 2 of our civilian protectors, a man by the name of Derek from the United Kingdom and a man by the name of Alessandro from Mexico, were escorting 14 women and children in South Sudan. Now, in South Sudan, there's been the reemergence of a civil war for about the last 16 months, and there has been brutality on all sides. So these women and children had been isolated in the bush, and they were being escorted by our 2 civilian protectors to an area adjacent to a UN compound. Shortly after they arrived, the area was attacked by an armed militia, and people were being shot point blank in the head. The 2 civilian protectors simply took the 14 women and children into a mud hut and stood in the doorway. On 3 occasions, the young militiamen with shiny new AK-47s came and said, you have to leave, we want those people. On all 3 occasions, the unarmed civilian protectors simply stood in the doorway, held up their identification cards showing they were with Nonviolent Peaceforce, said, we are unarmed, we are here to protect civilians, and we will not leave. After the 3rd time, the militia left. So that's one example. Another example from South Sudan, there are thousands of people who have been displaced. Many of them congregate in what are called protection of civilian areas. These are areas, they're not called camps because that would dignify the conditions too much, but people have assembled for some semblance of security adjacent to UN compounds. The women who are there have to go out every day to get wood, to get water, to grind sorghum, and there are patrols of soldiers who lurk outside the areas and will gang rape the women. Some of the women have told us that the soldiers say to them, we are doing this as part of our job. And that is a brutal honesty in terms of the way in which gender-based violence is used as a strategy in modern-day warfare. What we find is if 2 of our people accompany 20 or 30 women as they go out to collect firewood, water, grind their grain, the soldiers look the other way and leave them alone.
Do you think it's because it's because the men and women in your organization are not nationals from that country, that they're sort of a foreign witness? Is that why? I mean, you tell that story of the hut and they held up their badges, and I'm thinking, it's a plastic badge, it's a piece of paper in a plastic holder. How does that stop young men? Why did that work? Why does it work when they accompany the women to get food and water?
Well, in the first case, we could speculate that maybe they were just lucky. Mm-hmm. But these were well-trained people who knew what to do. In fact, I encourage people to go to our website, which is nonviolentpeaceforce.org, and look at the interview of Derek and Andreas. Mm-hmm. And they will talk about their training. They were trained what to do. Mm-hmm. And they talked about the training kicks in. Yeah. So there is that strategic portion. They also say if they were armed, they probably would have been killed. Yeah. But the equation changed because they were unarmed. Yeah. Perhaps they were lucky. Perhaps they were speaking to a higher power within those armed actors and appealing to that.
To either their sense of dignity or to God or faith,
yes.
or even maybe fear of their commanding officer who
Correct.
Does not want to end up in The Hague
Correct.
with them.
They know what to do if someone points a gun at them.
So you keep saying this, they're well trained. What does the training involve?
It's extensive. It involves, first of all, an understanding of nonviolence and an understanding of peacekeeping. Because what we're working on is really an historical merger. In the 20th century, we had the rise of active nonviolence throughout the century, and we saw that grow and mature and become more successful. And the latter half of the 20th century, we also had the emergence of peacekeeping. Mm-hmm. Peacekeeping was not part of the UN Charter. Mm-hmm. It was something that came along in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Now, that was primarily envisaged and practiced as armed peacekeeping. Yeah. So what we have now in the beginning of the 21st century is the coming together of peacekeeping and nonviolence and melding those two practices in effective ways to protect civilians. And so that's where we're at in terms of the training, first of all on nonviolence and on peacekeeping. Then people receive training on conflict analysis, which is very important. People always have to know the nature of the conflict, who's who, what's the history, what's the background, what are the command and control structures, and also then a context analysis as far as what's happening now, what's changed today, how does this affect the conflict. So they learn how to do those two analyses. Then they learn the methodologies, of which there are 10 methods that we employ in terms of unarmed civilian protection. And then they practice on how to apply and mix the various methodologies to various conflicts and various contexts. They also learn a great deal about communication, cross-cultural communication. Our teams come from a variety of countries. And it's important to note that half of our civilian protectors come from the host country. And in fact, in South Sudan, where our largest team is, a little over 150 people right now, over half come from South Sudan. The other 45% come from 25 different countries. And so people have to learn how to communicate quickly, how to communicate across cultural boundaries and understandings. They also have to learn empathy. We only work on a nonpartisan basis, and so people see some horrible things And yet they have to understand, they don't have to support it, but to understand the different points of view so that we can continue to provide protection to all civilians who are under threat.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned South Sudan. Where else is Nonviolent Peace Force operative?
We've had a team in Mindanao in the southern Philippines for the last 7 years. There has been a ceasefire there since 2009 that was brokered by the Malaysians and agreed to by both the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Since Nonviolent Peace Force is nonpartisan, we were invited by all of those parties to be a part of the monitoring of that ceasefire and given responsibility for the civilian protection component. What that meant was for 4 years we had 9 teams across the island who were monitoring, verifying, and reporting on breaches to the ceasefire, but also intervening if there were threats to civilian protection. So for example, there was one instance where a patrol of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and a patrol of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front were converging on a village. The villagers started to panic. They started to pack up to flee. Mm-hmm. The elders called our team that was close by and said what was happening. Our team said, we'll be there. En route, in this modern day, you have the local commanders on speed dial. So they called the local commanders of each group and said there must be a mistake. People are panicking, they're afraid, they're starting to flee. We know you don't want that to happen. And so to assure that doesn't happen, we'll go to the village and stay, which they did. And 1,000 people stayed home, and the 2 armed groups backed off. So we provided that monitoring, civilian-based ceasefire monitoring for 4 years, and more importantly, we trained 300 volunteers who live throughout the island in the elements of the ceasefire, how to monitor, how to verify. This spread the reach of that ceasefire agreement much deeper than typical agreements. And more importantly, it deepened the ownership where people believed they were a part of it, and indeed they were. That has led to a comprehensive peace agreement that was signed a little over a year ago and is being implemented right now. We hope that there will be full implementation by the end of 2016. Now there's many elements. I don't want to intimate that what we did led to the peace agreement, but it was a portion of it. Mm-hmm. We have a smaller team there that now is continuing to help provide stability during this fragile period from active conflict into peace building. Yeah. Based on that work, we were invited to Myanmar, where we are working with the various armed ethnic groups as well as the government on civilian-based ceasefire and how to move towards a comprehensive peace agreement there.
So where else are you looking ahead to?
We are starting a project in Ukraine where a couple of weeks ago we began training people from various sides in understanding civilian protection and violence reduction. Mm-hmm. And in June, we will start a project in Syria where we will be working with Syrian-based civil society groups, some of whom are in opposition to the government, some are neutral, and some support the government. And we'll be working with them in developing specific civilian-based protection as well as ceasefire and violence reduction and interruption kinds of projects for 15 to 20 areas that cross the political, religious, and geographic divides. Mm-hmm. Periodically, people will come together to reflect on what they've learned and to further plan how they're going to do this work and to strengthen the foundation for a future Syria that crosses those divides. And we believe strongly that that future lies in civil society. And civil society made up of Syrians who are committed to a pluralistic Syrian future.
Now, a number of times you have mentioned places there is active armed conflict. Have you ever lost anyone?
We have had in almost 12 years in the field now, we have had 3 conflict-related injuries. 2 of them were accidental, and the third was more serious when we had one of our people who was kidnapped in the Philippines 6 years ago, and he did receive injuries. Now, while we live and work in areas of violent conflict, we have very strict security protocols, and people are expected to live by those. If they don't, they're sent home. And so we aren't doing this to take foolish risks. We're doing this work because it is an effective way to protect civilians and to build a base for a peaceful future.
So how does your work differ, or does it differ from the work of the United Nations? Are you part of the UN? Do you work with the UN, independent of the UN? How does that work?
We do have consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And so we do work there and contribute to debates and discussions. A lot of my work over the past few years has been in increasing the recognition of unarmed civilian protection, the policy support, and funding. So we do receive funding in the field from a variety of UN agencies, most prominently UNICEF and the UN High Commission on Refugees. We are currently working with the UN Training and Research Institute, UNITAR, on an e-learning course that will have online 5 modules of how to do this work and be available to UN personnel as well as to people throughout the world. Because at the bottom line of this work is about developing and making available an effective method for protecting civilians and reducing violence. It's not about an organization. The organization is a vehicle. But what we want to do is to get this methodology out there, to test it, and then to make it available to as many different entities as possible. Because we can do this work, Mark, without bringing in more guns and more drones and more bombs. In fact, our colleagues, for example, in Syria are telling us enough guns. That's just making it worse. And so it's the direction where we're going. None of this is perfect. And we don't say unarmed civilian protection works in every situation. But it's a matter of the direction that we're going. And how do we build peaceful, sustainable futures as opposed to militarized, violent futures?
So hard about the work you do is that it's almost unmeasurable, because when you're successful, nothing happens, right? There isn't a massacre, there isn't a shooting, there isn't another war. This has been really inspiring, and I know the people who are watching will certainly want to learn more, and you've mentioned your webpage. What else can those who are watching this video right now, what else can they do? How can they be part of the good work that you and the rest of your team at Nonviolent Peaceforce are doing?
There are lots of opportunities. First of all, go to our website at nonviolentpeaceforce.org. There are opportunities for people to become unarmed civilian protectors. It's the best, most difficult job you'll ever have. We typically ask for a commitment of 2 years. It is a paid job. This is professional. People will be well trained and supported to do this work, and they will be challenged and be part of a transformation that's transforming how the world deals with violent conflict. So that's the most dramatic way that people can be involved. We always are taking interns in our Minneapolis office, in our Brussels office, and working with me in New York. So those opportunities are available. We also have volunteers who work with us in helping to promote the idea, to set up educational events, to fundraise because we need money, to continue our operations, which brings up the next way that people can support us, and that is by making in the United States, tax-deductible contributions to Nonviolent Peaceforce. We need this money to continue to develop and to grow and make this idea available to many. There are also, we are encouraging academia to get more involved, to study this, to have classes, and there are classes in various parts of the country right now that are looking at this, because we need to be torn apart. We need to have independent people looking at us and pointing out both what we're doing right and what are our flaws, so that we can continue to make this a more effective instrument.
Thank you. Your work is inspiring. I wish you the best with it, and I'm glad we were able to help in this small way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's good talking with you.